professor from Stanford.
All right. Is this one working now when I turn this on? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Who knows where that phantom sound is coming from? I think it may be gone now. It's really wonderful to be back here. I was a graduate student at Harvard from 2011 to 16 over on the main campus at Maxwell Dworkin. This, the site across the river was always a mythical thing back then, and it's great to see it actually in reality here. And I really think that this Institute for Natural and Artificial Intelligence is very inspiring, and something that I've tried to hopefully live up to in a small way in the talk today. And when I think about the name of this institute, I'm actually reminded of a story from a book that Leslie Valiant wrote and that I read when I was a graduate student. He tells a story about when he was a young assistant professor just getting started. He went to a computer science conference and had a conversation with one of the more senior figures in the field, Dijkstra, who anybody who's taken an algorithms class will be familiar with that name. And Dijkstra asks him, well, what are you interested in? Les says, I'm thinking about AI. And Dijkstra says, well, why not just study I? And that anecdote really stuck with me. I think that he makes a really important point. Let's study intelligence, not study it in just one form. Let's study it in all the forms that it takes. And for somebody who's at that time as a graduate student trying to think about how I could contribute to the study of intelligence and where I could make a mark, this really, this book and that story in particular really stuck with me. I think one hallmark of intelligence that we see across the board, not just in biology, but in artificial systems, is the ability to maintain, update, and persist internal states, and then to act accordingly based on those internal states. We see that in the brain, taking in sensory inputs and performing computations based on those inputs and producing appropriate behavioral outputs. We also see it in artificial systems. We see it in transformers, where maybe you have to get a bit more creative with your definition of state, all the context in your context window or the contents of your KV cache, but the ability to take in prompts and produce complex structured outputs like this Kalman filter written in JAX that I just think is really mind-blowing that our systems these days can do this. Now, why is it an interesting and exciting time to be trying to study these questions of intelligence? Well, on the neural side, it's the advances that we have in our ability to record large numbers of neurons from awake, freely behaving animals using head-mounted microscopes or neuropixels probes, to simultaneously measure the behavioral outputs of those nervous systems using high-quality key point tracking systems, and like what you see here. And then, as I'll talk a little bit about today, the ability to pair these things with really fine-tuned, fine-grained optogenetic stimulation to test predictions of our generative models. Let me just move this up because I feel like I might be cutting in and out a little bit. Hopefully that's a bit better. Now, of course, on the machine learning side, I don't think we need much motivation for why this is an exciting time in the field of machine learning and AI. We just saw 2 Nobel Prizes given out for advances in these disciplines. And these are largely powered by advances in computer hardware, things like the H100 GPUs coming out of NVIDIA, the transformer architectures that are behind a lot of the modern large language models that we see. I think together, these really make it an exciting time for our field to be working at this intersection. So today I want to split this talk into 2 parts. I want to spend the first part of today talking about natural intelligence and how state space models that we're working on have been really successful in trying to elucidate mechanisms of neural computation and persisting these internal states that I was just talking about. And then transition to talking about how these same types of tools, perhaps surprisingly, can be quite powerful in developing artificially intelligent systems, for example, for long-range sequence modeling. To dive into this first part, and I should say, please feel free to interrupt me at any point as we go along. In the first part, I want to start with a question. How does the brain represent and maintain internal states? I'll tell you about some methodological work that we've done, and I'll go through this part quickly because I think many in the room have heard this before about recurrent switching linear dynamical systems. Then I want to tell you about a sequence of really exciting new results using these methods to study attractor dynamics in the hypothalamus and how they relate to aggression, and how that's then fed back into new methodological work within my group. So first and foremost, I want to acknowledge the collaborators with whom we've been working on this project. Adi Nair, who is a fantastic graduate student at Caltech, David Anderson, who is a PI there, and then Ann Kennedy, who actually introduced us, kickstarted a lot of this work. And Adi helped to prepare some of the slides coming here. So the starting point is a small subregion of a small nucleus in the hypothalamus of a mouse brain. And you can barely see it on the screen here. It's that little red dot at the base of the brain. And this is called the ventromedial hypothalamus ventrolateral subdivision, VMHVL. And within that region, we're studying just the subpopulation of neurons that express this estrogen receptor, ESR1 cells. And a finding from 2014 in David Anderson's group was that when you optogenetically stimulate this population of neurons, you can elicit attack behavior.
You feel like we need to change the lights, or we're going to have a lot of stuff with this darkness? Or
There's going to be about 50-50 dark and
okay, so
There's just some danger that everything will go black.
try.
everything may go black.
Okay.
When the lights on, it's
Oh, no, it's flat. Yeah.
I'll try that one.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's natural.
Natural intelligence. Okay.
So in this experiment, when the light goes on, it's optogenically stimulating this small population. There's about a couple hundred cells in this this region, and you'll see that this black mouse will start to go after this white mouse when they were very peacefully cohabitating before. Light turns on, and it elicits very strong aggressive behavior as a response, which suggests that this region is somehow involved in the control of these aggressive behaviors. Maybe it's even a labeled line. Stimulate, you get this behavior out. But in subsequent work, they found that the story is a little bit more subtle. They used miniscope imaging here to record about 100 neurons simultaneously in this population. You can see a handful of those traces here shown on the left. And what you see is that the neural activity is kind of broadly distributed. It's not tuned to just a particular interaction, sniffing or biting or whatever. It's kind of active throughout. And that's also reflected in these choice probability histograms, which show that only a small number of neurons seem to be really predictive of one type of behavior or another. So perhaps what's going on here is actually something a bit more subtle, something at the population level. And the hypothesis is that this region of the brain, the ventrolateral subdivision of the ventromedial hypothalamus, is important for encoding an internal state of aggressiveness, and that it's the collective activity of populations of cells in this brain region that are representing that state, and moreover, that it's able to persist for long time scales, much longer than the time scales of individual cells, but all the way up to minutes long that you'll see these states persisting. Now, the question is, how can we go about trying to test that hypothesis? And in order to do so, we're going to formalize this problem using a probabilistic model. So here is now a couple minutes of activity of all of the cells that were recorded in that experiment. And you can see them all laid out here in this plot on the left. And the way we're going to think about this data is that at any point in time, the neural activity can be thought of as a vector of values representing for each one of the n neurons, how active it was, what was this calcium fluorescence intensity at that point in time. And then as time progresses, you'll see this activity trace out a trajectory through this high-dimensional neural state space. Now, the interesting component of this hypothesis is that neural activity is presumed to encode something much lower dimensional, this aggressive state that may be only 1 or 2 dimensional, who knows? And what that suggests is that perhaps this activity lies much closer to a low dimensional manifold in this high dimensional space, as indicated by this plane here. And the corresponding nearby points on this plane are what we'll think of as the continuous latent state at time t. And so the goal would be, given these noisy observations, can we infer the corresponding trajectory on this low dimensional manifold, this green trajectory, instead of that noisy blue trajectory that we started with? And moreover, can we infer or estimate the dynamics function that tells or that governs how these states evolve over time? Something like this flow field that you see here, this dynamics function f. Why might those flow fields be interesting? Well, it's because different dynamical motifs have been hypothesized to underlie different types of computation. I hear that Mark Churchland was here last week, so you probably saw a lot of rotational dynamics in his talk. I didn't see it, but I think that's a safe bet. And that's because oftentimes these types of dynamics are exhibited in motor cortex as monkeys are performing stereotyped reaching tasks. But other dynamical systems have also been hypothesized and found in various parts of the brain. Point attractors as ways of representing memory, saddle points for decision making, and as we'll talk a lot about today, line attractors for integration. Now, the methodological question that I'm interested in, and I put my statistician hat on, is how can I infer these latent states? How can I estimate these dynamical systems from noisy neural and possibly also behavioral time series data? So the way that we do that is using what we call probabilistic state space models. And if you're not familiar with pictures like this, I'll walk you through it very quickly. This graphical model consists of a handful of nodes. The nodes that are filled in are observed variables. In this case, the activity traces y1 through y big T. The nodes that are unfilled are the so-called latent variables, the things we wish to infer. So in this case, it's the sequence of latent states, x1 through xt, the dynamics function f, and also the function g that maps latent states to observation, that defines essentially that orientation of that manifold. And the arrows tell us the dependency structure. What do you need to know in order to simulate the next variable in this graphical model? And there are many choices of models that you could choose, many different decisions about how you could parameterize that function f, for example. And I like to think of these as lying on a spectrum, where on the left-hand side, we have relatively simple, low parameter models, things like your classic linear models. On the right, we have highly flexible models, but perhaps more data intensive, think neural networks, maybe Gaussian processes. And somewhere in the middle, there's this sweet spot where I think things like switching linear dynamical systems fall, which I'll tell you about next. But first, what can a simple linear model do? Well, it turns out that linear models can actually do a whole lot. All of these 4 examples that I showed here are examples of linear models. And moreover, if we have a linear model, if we're fortunate that our data actually is well described by such a model, we can do a lot of things. We can analytically calculate fixed points. We can figure out stationary distributions. We can think about dynamics along eigenmodes, optimal control. Many tools are at our disposal if we're fortunate to be in this regime. But unfortunately, most dynamical systems cannot be expressed as simple linear models. For example, if you have bistable dynamics with 2-point attractors, you need nonlinear dynamics. If you have a ring attractor, you need nonlinear dynamics. And so how can we balance these 2 concerns? Well, one simple idea is that we could approximate these nonlinear systems by piecewise linear dynamics. So different linear dynamics operating in different parts of state space. And in terms of a graphical model, this is what that might look like. This is a switching linear dynamical system. It now has 2 layers of latent variables, discrete states z, continuous states x. And given the discrete state z, it tells you which one of your different linear dynamics operators to apply. You have some transition matrix that tells you then how to switch between different discrete states over time. This can be a simple Markov transition matrix. But there is one problem with that story. And that's that if you just have a simple Markov transition matrix, this model doesn't know anything about where to switch between different dynamical regimes. It doesn't know to use red on the left and blue on the right, or red in the middle and blue on the outside. It has no knowledge of how and when to switch. And so a small tweak that you could make to this model, and the one that we'll use in the rest of the talk, is what we call a recurrent switching linear system. And it just adds one more dependency. It says, to update your discrete states, you need to know what state you're in and also where you are on this manifold. And intuitively, you should think of this as basically partitioning the manifold in such a way that you probabilistically are more likely to use one state or another, one part of the state space or another. So that's the whirlwind tour of recurrent switching linear dynamical systems. As I said, I'm going through it quickly because I know I've talked to many of you about this over time. If you do have questions, please feel free to interrupt and ask. But now I want to transition and talk about how we're actually using it. Yeah, Sean.
What's the motivation for using these in that, like there's a lot of ways you can try to directly model the nonlinear dynamics and put in nonlinear features. Because it's unclear if this is actually the right model. Like the ground truth is really some nonlinear dynamic persistent. You're trying to approximate. So, yeah, so why are you preferring this?
Yeah. I'll just repeat the question in case it wasn't heard by everybody. So the question is, why use this particular model instead of a more general nonlinear dynamical systems model? Are we potentially biasing ourselves in a way that is incompatible with a ground truth nonlinear dynamical system? I think there's two reasons, at least. So one reason is that from an interpretability standpoint, if we fit a model that decomposes the state space into regions with different linear dynamics, it makes it easy to go back in afterward and analyze different regions of this state space in terms of their eigenmodes, as we'll see in the coming slides. I think another is that we want to be able to fit these models to relatively small amounts of data for reasons that'll become clear in a little bit here. We don't want to have models that require enormous amounts of neural data in order to estimate their parameters. And so from a parsimony perspective, this is a nice way to reduce the complexity of the model. But you're right, like this is an assumption that needs to be tested. And so we do a lot of hyperparameter selection to sweep over numbers of discrete states and decide that appropriate amount of complexity based on held out likelihood. And you can show that under certain assumptions, if you tile the space with enough linear systems and the true function of interest is smooth enough that you can effectively this is a non-parametric way of estimating that function in that. So great question. And I think you'll see some of the benefits as we go further. Yeah. Yeah, why is this model assuming that neural dynamics are restricted to a low dimensional manifold? So, one, this is an assumption of the statistical model that may or may not be true, and this is another thing that we test. We'll sweep over the dimension of that latent state and ask, at what point do we start to see diminishing returns and explained variance or held out likelihood? And it's perhaps interesting and surprising that in many systems we do find that these dimensions can be on the order of 4 to 6 when you record 100 neurons in this case. So it didn't have to be that way. But I think also probably as you saw in Mark's talk, there are many cases that we're accruing in neuroscience where that seems to be the case, where this low dimensional assumption is warranted.
So I guess if the dimension of X is large, it's probably difficult to estimate the probability distribution of Z accurately. I wonder if you incorporate any knowledge about the low dimension neural manifold to kind of simplify the optimization process.
So the only real assumption here is that the manifold is a linear manifold of some dimension that we're going to treat as a hyperparameter. In this case, it's going to end up being around 4 to 6 in most sessions. And that the dynamics or the boundaries between partitions are linear, but we're going to relax that assumption in some versions of the model that I'll talk about toward the end of this section. Beyond that, we don't build in more assumptions about where things switch or anything like that.
I guess my question is that in the second row, you're estimating the probability distribution of Z over the space of X, right? But and then the dimensionality of the space of X is equal to the number of recorded neurons, right?
No, it's equal to the dimension of the planes. It's 2 dimensions in the picture that. Okay, so let's look and see what this actually does when we study that population of VMH-VL neurons. So again, this is in the context of this aggressive social interaction. We fit this RSLDS, we get 4 to 6 dimensions, and then we pick the top 2 dimensions that explain the most variance to here show you. And we get these trajectories that when the intruder mouse is placed in, there's a big jump up to the top, and then it slowly but steadily decays back down into this region of state space in the middle. Sorry, my pointer is a little dim. But this region where it just slowly progresses through up and to the left, which to us looks a lot like a line attractor, and I'll provide some more quantification of that in a second. What's interesting is that when it enters into this region of state space, first you see sniffing-like behaviors. Then over the time course of minutes, you start to see that escalate into dominance mounting and eventually into attack behavior, biting, etc. So ramping up along this dimension seems to correlate with more aggressive behavior. Another way to visualize this flow field is in terms of this energy landscape where there's a clear trough where these states are falling into, and then over time, progressing down this trough, down this basin of attraction. And position along this trough, again, correlates with the nature of the behavior that we're seeing the mouse execute.
What's energy in that?
So this energy here is derived from the flow field. It's not a perfect representation of the flow field, but it's basically like how, what is the magnitude of the arrows and what direction they point. So if you ran a ball or a hockey puck, I don't know, whatever your favorite analogy is, where would it fall? And in this case, it would fall down into this basin of attraction. And if we look along the activity projected just onto that one dimension, which I should emphasize was found by looking at the eigenvectors of the corresponding linear dynamical system spit out by the RSLDS model, we can see that over the time course of 200 seconds in this example, there's this big ramping up that's happening slowly but surely as the animal transitions from these sniffing to attack behaviors. And we can further quantify that by looking at these time constants of the dynamics matrix associated with this basin of attraction. And we see that there's one mode that has a very long time constant associated with it, time constant around 100 seconds, which again is much longer than any intrinsic time constants of individual cells, suggesting this is really a population level phenomenon, this persistence that we're seeing in this population activity. And finally, this is not just true of any system that we look at. It's not even just true of any system we look at in the hypothalamus. For example, if you look at another hypothalamic nucleus, MPOA, you see very different dynamics. I'm not showing them here, but more like point attractor type dynamics instead. We think this is a pretty interesting and unique feature or salient feature of this population of cells. What's also interesting is that if we look across animals, we see differences in that basin of attraction. So in animals that are more aggressive, we see that this basin is flatter, so the persistence is maintained for longer. In animals that are less aggressive, this basin is more tilted, so the ramps up in aggression more quickly decay back down to less aggressive states, which is consistent again with the outward-facing behavior that we can measure. Now, so far, all of these have been observational findings. These were just fitting a statistical model to population level recordings and then characterizing the dynamical system that we found. And now the question that we wanted to ask next, and which involved some really heavy lifting from a postdoc in David's group, Amit, was to try to causally test this system. Nobody, to our knowledge, has causally demonstrated that a line attractor like this is intrinsic to any circuit in the mammalian brain. There's beautiful work looking at ring attractors in the fly brain and causally manipulating them. There's work on point attractors in the ALM in the mouse brain. But line attractors like this, we haven't seen any demonstration. And what we'd like to do is be able to go in using these optogenetic tools, hit this system, and see if it responds as predicted by this dynamical system model. So the dream experiment would be something like this. We'd like to head fix the mouse under a 2-photon microscope. We'd like to fit our model. Well, first of all, we'd like to instantiate line attractor dynamics in this head fixed prep, which is not obvious because when mice are head fixed, they don't fight one another. So we need some way to instantiate this attractor in this more constrained setting. But if we could do that, then we'd like to go in, measure these cells, figure out by fitting our model to data on that session, which cells would be predicted to move the system along the attractor or orthogonal to it, and then hit them optogenetically and see how the system responds. It seems like a lot to ask. What saved the day was a paper from Nirao Shah's lab at Stanford showing that there are effectively mirror neurons in this system. So these same cells that we've been studying, these ESR1 cells in VMHBL, they showed were also active when mice observed aggression, not just when they were engaged in aggressive interaction. And that's kind of the key that we need, because we can have mice observe aggressive interactions when they're head fixed. So this is the setup. First, we have the mouse engage in these types of aggressive interactions. We measure neural activity using this implanted lens. We figure out which cells are implicated in this attractor. And then we have the mouse sit out on the side while it watches two other mice go at it. And what we find is that the same cells that are involved in this attractor when the mice are allowed to freely move are also exhibiting attractor dynamics when the mouse is head fixed watching. So there's about a 70% overlap in these cells, suggesting it's the same population doing the same thing, more or less. And now the test would be as follows. We're going to have the mouse watch this aggressive interaction for about 5 minutes. We're going to collect some data. Again, back to Shyam's question, we're talking about a small amount of data on a single session, trying to figure out how to fit this model and make a prediction that we can then test before we have to take the mouse off the rig. We have to be pretty quick about this. We need not only to work with small data, but also to have the fitting algorithms be efficient. If we can do that, then we'd like to make the following prediction. If this attractor is intrinsic to this circuit, then stimulating cells that have high loading on this attractor dimension would move the neural state over along this attractor and that it would persist there. In contrast, if we hit cells that are orthogonal to this, we would expect it to move up the well and come back down. If the attractor is not intrinsic, i.e., if it's just a readout of some other population of cells that's doing the integration, and this is just a downstream readout, moving or hitting neurons that move along this dimension wouldn't be predicted to have a lasting effect. You would just move it transiently and it would fall back to whatever this external input is telling it to do. So two different predictions in terms of the response, but both would be consistent with this observation of a long time constant in this population of cells in the observational model. So what do we see? Well, when we perturb this system, and the perturbation is actually very minimal, I think. It's stimulating 5 neurons in this field of view, the ones with the strongest loading on this attractor dimension. We see that this, first of all, there's a quick jump in that state and it decays back down, but not to the baseline, to an elevated point of activity. You hit it again, goes slightly higher. Eventually this thing saturates, but it's clearly ramping up in its baseline activity after each pulse. And you can see that aggregated across mice in terms of this integrated activity, exactly as the model predicts we should see from stimulating this set of neurons on manifold, as we call it. I already made this point that computationally, I think this is one of the benefits of using these RSLDS models for doing this type of closed loop perturbation experiment. Now, again, what's the control? If we hit 5 other neurons, the ones that are most loaded onto this orthogonal dimension, the prediction is that you'll go up and you'll come right back down to wherever you were before. And again, you see exactly that. And you see same thing aggregated across mice. It does not lead to integration along this orthogonal.
But I'm curious whether you had any behavioral readouts that integration led to some change in this internal state of the animal because they're head fixed. So I guess was there any way to tell?
Yeah, you probably are a reviewer too, aren't you? Yeah. Yeah, this is a really good question and one that we did get asked in review. So we looked carefully at facial movements, hoping that we would see the mouse snarl or something as it got into this more aggressive state. We didn't find anything significant there. It's possible that this integration of this aggressive internal state doesn't, it gets gated before the behavioral output. Like, why would the mouse start attacking something that's not there? That wouldn't be a very realistic behavior. But, I think there's more work to be done. Like, because we would like to be able to do this in the freely moving setting where we stimulate these 5 neurons and see that it actually makes it more aggressive as measured by outward behavior. But we don't know how to do that in a freely moving mouse yet.
Can't do like a VR with another mouse.
I'll talk to David about it. I can't do that, but maybe he can. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I think David could do, and additionally, it's also a mirror experiment. And the picture would be that when you're when you're pushed towards one side of the slide factor, the animal should be aggressive. David's shown before that it would stimulate these neurons will attack the limit. This lasts 100 seconds. You could imagine doing the stimulus.
Take the mouse off. Yeah.
I think there's a picture there that was true of biology that once an animal has observed aggression, it should itself be aggressive.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So it might be like you're saying, might be the data somewhere else, but I don't think that's true for the observed.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either. Whether, again, just to repeat it, presumably, these same types of ramping up dynamics are, well, we don't know if this is happening naturally. If there are some inputs that are moving the system along the attractor as it observes this aggression in the same way as when we perturb it optogenetically, but we could perturb it optogenetically, and as long as manipulating it, moving the mouse into the environment doesn't completely reset that state, you would expect a behavioral or aggressive behavior out. Yeah.
But how stable are these two subsets? Like, can you stimulate for many rounds and get the same dynamics?
Yes, there's a lot of supplementary figures showing what happens as we repeatedly stimulate throughout the session. Again, I would say there's a lot of exciting and interesting work to be done going forward. This version of the closed loop perturbation is still on the basic end of the spectrum, where we just fit the model, found 5 neurons that were most heavily loaded, and then perturbed those. But there's all sorts of interesting work going on. I'm familiar with some from Ian Paninsky's group, but I know there's others trying to design the optimal perturbation to produce either produce some desired behavioral output or provide the most information about the system in question. Here we still have uncertainty about the dynamical system, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. And you can imagine also using these perturbations to reduce that uncertainty. Well,
is it true in most mice, and is it a correct general way to think about this, that your progress along the line attractor can essentially be boiled down to the activity level among a select group of neurons? And a related question is, do you know if this effect was non-cell autonomous? Like if you stimulated below a critical number of neurons, did it go away faster?
those are great questions, Caleb. So we are actively looking into the nature of the cells that are involved in this attractor, and I'll show in a second that maybe in 2 slides I'll show you that they do seem to be functionally connected subgroup of cells in this population. As for the threshold effect, I don't know the answer. I mean, I suspect that the reason we went to 5 is because with 4 we didn't see quite as robust of an effect, but I don't know exactly how that scales up. And that's something I will follow up on. So if we look at this from the flow field perspective, what's going on here? We stimulate along the attractor. You see the state move to the right. There is a slight decay, so it's not a perfect attractor, but it's a pretty good model that bumps out and comes back. And the orthogonal dimension here, it bumps it off. It comes back to nearly the same point. And again, we think that this is strong evidence, and maybe the first evidence for this type of intrinsic line attractor in a mammalian circuit. Caleb, to your question about the mechanisms, perhaps, and it's a population of cells. One piece of evidence that that I think is pretty interesting here is that if you stimulate a single cell, you can get activation in unperturbed cells that are also projecting along this attractor. This is different from showing the population state as a whole, but it's showing at least in some of these X1 projecting neurons a ramp up from that single cell perturbation. And again, that's opposite of what you see when you stimulate the off manifold neurons, the ones that are orthogonal to the line attractor. And it suggests that there is some functional coupling of these cells, likely mediated, at least in part, by glutamatergic connections between them. But we think there's more to this story, and this comes to work from George Montefaris, who used a technique that is pretty mind-boggling. He calls it CRISPR scope. But the idea is that to selectively knock out neuropeptides in this population of cells, these ESR1 cells, using this combination of CRISPR and this optical imaging setup. And what you find is that in control mice, you get the nice line attractor, but when you knock out these oxytocin receptors, you get that line attractor is very much disrupted, which, consistent with some of our other stimulations, suggests that it's not just fast glutamatergic interactions, but there's also some slow neurotransmission that's at play in instantiating this attractor dynamics. And then finally, it's not just unique to aggression. there are other settings in which the same nucleus here in the female mice are producing similar types of attractor dynamics. In this case, it's in the context of mating behavior. And only during proestrus, you see this line attractor, very similar types of line attractor dynamics. And then during the non-proestrus phases of the estrus cycle, these dynamics are completely reshaped and look more like point attractors. So I think that what we're seeing here is that these types of integration mechanisms, attractor dynamics, are a very general type of mechanism for this nucleus within the hypothalamus, and something that plays a really fundamental role across many behaviors for maintaining internal states over very long time constants. So that line of work was all on the experimental results. This also inspired new methodological work that I just want to tell you about very briefly. Thinking about how we can go beyond this recurrent SLDS model to something that's a bit more of a general purpose nonlinear dynamical systems model. Again, coming back to this question of, are we making too strong or too rigid of modeling assumptions? And so this is work that was led by a grad student, Amber Hu, in my group. And the idea is to parameterize that dynamics function f as a draw from a Gaussian process, but not to throw the RSLDS inductive biases out the window altogether, but rather to try to constrain this GP to produce functions. Gaussian processes are distributions over random functions. We want to constrain that distribution to produce functions that are piecewise linear and smoothly varying at the boundaries. And as telling Stem, I'm very bad at naming things. So we called this a GP SLDS because it is a hybrid of an SLDS and a Gaussian process. I will try to come up with more evocative. So how does it work? Well, a Gaussian process, as I said, is a distribution over functions. And one such type of functions that it can produce are linear functions. And this is done using what's called a linear kernel. In our case, draws from the linear kernel produce linear dynamical systems, flow fields like we see here. And that's great, but that's only one ingredient. The other thing that we want is some way to partition this state space up into regions that are going to use different linear dynamics in different parts of space. And so that's going to be an extra function that we're going to learn over on the left here, pi of x. And once we have these two things, we're just going to compose them together in a very simple way. We're going to define our smoothly switching kernel as a weighted sum of these linear kernels, where the weights are determined by how likely it is that these 2 points, x and x prime, belong to the same part of the partition. Are they both in the inside? Are they both in the outside, et cetera? And if they're both in the same part of the partition, then we're going to constrain them to follow the same linear dynamics using this shared linear kernel. Different parts of the state space will have different linear dynamics. So a draw from this Gaussian process might look something like this, where you've got flow fields that emanate out from the middle, but then maybe spiral back in from the outside. And once we have that Gaussian process, we're going to use it to simulate a dynamical system. Here we did it in continuous time, but you could have done it in discrete time like I described above. So the nice things about this approach are that it still produces these piecewise linear dynamics that we liked about the RSLDS. It does so in a way that has very nice direct parameterization. The parameters of these linear kernels tell us about fixed points that we care about. Pi can be anything. It doesn't have to be linear decision boundaries. It can be any nonlinear function that you learn. And moreover, it enforces smooth dynamics at the boundaries between discrete states. It doesn't have this weird property where there's always a probability of using one state or another, and those states could push you in different directions. It's always a consistent set of linear dynamics at each point in state space. So we think this is a nice advance upon the RSLDS from 8 years ago or whatever it was. And we're starting to incorporate this more into our analyses. And one of the benefits of doing this is that when we fit this Gaussian process, we don't just get a point estimate of dynamics, we also get uncertainty estimates. So we can say, how confident are we in the dynamics at different parts of state space? And more specifically, how confident are we that any point in state space is a slow point, is an attractor point? And here we see that these attractors really do trace out a very nice line in this state space, even when we fit this more general model. So again, giving us more confidence when we call this an attractor. Absent perturbation, it's hard to say, is it attractor-like or is it a real attractor? I think here we're just adding more evidence to this claim. Okay. So that's what I wanted to tell you about how we're using state space models to study computation in the brain, and in particular in the hypothalamus. Maybe I'll pause in case there are any more questions on that part, and otherwise I'll switch gears and go to the next. Yeah.
My question is about like which kind of data do you need if you see like models? Do you just need observational data or you need to find them?
Well, we fit the model to observational data. We try to validate the model with perturbation, causal perturbation.
Without any observation. Like
Using observational data, we find what appear to be attractors, but we were always very careful to say attractor-like, because until we do that perturbation experiment, we really don't know, is it an attractor or is it just a readout of an upstream attractor? And here I think we have nice evidence that it is intrinsic. So I had an interesting conversation with Tengiz earlier about when we can really make that claim and when it's a little too much. But I think this is strong evidence in favor. There was one in the back there, yeah.
Okay, so I'm curious whether, so you mentioned earlier that the BMHBL seemed to be prone to the line attractor dynamics across different behaviors, but it wasn't the case in other brain areas. And I wonder whether you have any insight into what, how the biological constraint, whether the wiring diagram or other properties of the area that you are looking might be determining those dynamics, and whether you have just hypotheses like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, why is MPOA not showing attractor dynamics, but BMHBL is? I think we still have more work to do to really elucidate the mechanisms. Like I said in BMHBL, we see what looks like glutamatergic interactions among these attractor neurons, and also some other slow mechanism, neuropeptides likely, but probably the fact that it goes away with the different phases of the estrous cycle suggests there's also hormonal influence on this. And they tested that causally, by trying to modulate estrogen levels and see if that affected the dynamics as well. So there's, I think, a lot of factors that are all contributing to these circuit dynamics. And it's probably not just a simple fine-tuned excitatory coupling. There's probably a lot of things going on, and whether or why MPOA doesn't have that, I honestly don't know. I think Catherine Duloc's lab here has done a ton of work toward answering those questions too, and so I don't know if she's here, but I'm sure she would have a lot to say on that. Yeah, that.
if there's some processing actually getting like how this process so the fact
I don't know if I heard the whole question. I think you said, are there pre-processing steps that might be biasing us towards seeing attractors or not?
like
Line attractors especially? I see. Yeah, we did try to test whether this was a property of the calcium indicator that we're looking at. This is all calcium imaging. We see that, first of all, the dynamics are much longer than the times constants of any one of the calcium indicators, and it's robust to the choice of particular indicator. The cell extraction method is using CNMFE. So, sorry, there's a ton of acronyms in this talk, but that's what we're using. And I don't, off the top of my head, I can't think of any reason why that would, give you a line attractor and not a plane attractor. But so I guess all I can say is we tried to, check all the boxes there as we were making analysis. All right, sorry, there were more questions.
Just a quick one, so if you have a low number of neurons, like tens or hundreds, it makes sense to get one attractor. But if you recorded like 10 million, would this model still just spit out one attractor, or would it make like a hierarchy of them? How would you adjust with scale?
That's a good question. So I don't know if I said it, but this particular population actually only has a couple hundred cells of these ESR1 cells in BMHBL. So it's actually a pretty small number of neurons of which we're recording a reasonable fraction, which is different than most of the settings I think we work in systems neuroscience. But hypothetically, if we were studying a larger population, 100 neurons in cortex, where you might argue there's thousands of neurons that are part of the effective circuit. What would you expect to find? So, the RSLDS model is biased toward giving you a flow field that parcellates into different regions with linear dynamics within each one. That said, if the data suggests that at some point in state space you can be in any one of two different dynamical regimes, then it does have the capacity to do that, which is different than the GPS LDS model I was talking about. So whether that's a feature or a bug, I think in many cases I think of it as an undesirable property, but for the examples you're talking about, it sure. Yeah, I think, yeah, I'll have to think more about it, but this question of what happens when you undersample, I think, is an important one for us in neuroscience. I think in this particular regime, we're fortunate that we're not undersampling as tremendously as we are in others. All right, let's switch gears and talk about the second part of the talk. At this point, you may be thinking linear dynamical systems or simple compositions of them are good for fighting and sex, and maybe those are not that sophisticated or intellectual of pursuits. Maybe for code generation, I need something a bit more fancy. I can't get by with these simple models. But I think the punchline from the second part is that actually you can get a lot of mileage by simply composing linear dynamical systems. I want to break this again down into 4 parts. Can these simple compositions do complex things? We'll tell you about how they can using simple state space layers and parallel scans. I'll show a couple of results on machine learning benchmarks, and I'll end with some recent work trying to push beyond the linear regime. Again, acknowledging those who did the work, Jimmy Smith, who actually is a founding scientist at a company that just spun out of MIT that's using these types of models in practice for code generation. Andy Warrington, who is a postdoc, and then Javier Gonzalez, who dressed up for today. This is building on work from Albert and Chris, and many others. So, recurrent neural network. Let's start here. So in this picture, it looks a lot like before. Everything is deterministic now, so we're not assuming any stochasticity. We have inputs at the bottom that are fed into this hidden state that's being updated over time according to some dynamics function f, and then producing outputs y. What's nice about these models is that they allow for very fast autoregressive generation. Once you've got your state at time t, you can roll that forward using this dynamical system. You don't need to call back to all of your previous hidden states in your context window. It's all nicely localized into this hidden state. However, the evaluation of these models, if you want to train this thing up, you got to give it inputs and outputs, or target outputs, and ask, how likely is my current setting of f to have produced those outputs? And it looks like that's inherently a sequential computation. You have to start with x naught, feed it forward in time in order to produce your output. By contrast, things like transformers allow for very fast parallel evaluation because you can take in this whole sequence of inputs, perform your attention computations across for every single token, attend to every other token all at once, and produce a whole sequence of outputs without going through this sequential process. And I think that this may actually be one of the biggest reasons why these methods or architectures are so successful. Not necessarily that attention is doing something magical, though I think it is important, but rather that the parallelism that's inherent in this architecture lends itself to modern hardware. GPUs are, when you train a transformer, you're getting very good GPU utilization. When you evaluate a recurrent neural network, you're getting vanishing fraction of GPU utilization because you're doing very small computation at any point in time. The downside, of course, is that with transformers, autoregressive generation is costly, and there's been tons of engineering work on how to reduce that cost because OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, everybody wants to be able to run these things on the fly as you're typing in Colab, produce predictions of what you're going to say next. And if that involves looking back at 1 million tokens of context, then you're going to be burning a lot of GPUs to actually perform that compute. So, one of the goals of this research is to ask, is there any way to get the best of both worlds? And one observation is that if we restrict ourselves to linear RNN, linear dynamical systems from before, we actually have a lot more tools at our disposal. So by linear RNN, what I mean is that that dynamics function f is really just a linear matrix multiply, matrix vector multiply. Xt plus 1 is axt plus b times ut. Your outputs, we'll assume, are linear as well. Now, why is that beneficial? Well, it's because you can now write your output at time t is just a convolution of all of the inputs that came before. And that convolution kernel, you can expand it out analytically. It looks something like this. And it's basically just casting that whole linear filter as a convolution, which is not surprising to anybody who's taken a signal processing class. That's why we love linear filters, for example. So this lends itself to both fast autoregressive generation. For that, you instantiate the states and you run them forward. But at train time, you use these convolutions to perform this computation. Now, this is essentially what Albert Gu et al. Proposed in their method called S4. They said, well, a single linear layer has these nice properties of fast generation, fast evaluation, but of course, it's still just a linear model. How can we make more expressive sequence-to-sequence models? Well, we'll just stack these things on top of one another, and we'll glue them together with some nonlinearities, which I've just called B in this picture. So the way I like to think about it is that these linear models have linear dynamics in time, but nonlinear interactions across depth. Now, the devil, of course, is in the details. So if you unpack the S4 paper, there is a fair amount of sophistication on how exactly they construct this model, and I won't walk you through the whole thing. The takeaway is just that it's a lot and involves things that I had to learn about in order to understand what was going on. Part of the reason is that this kernel itself is length L, and you want to be able to evaluate that thing or to instantiate that kernel and its Fourier transform very efficiently. And there's a lot of tricks that go into doing so. So this is basically where Jimmy and the rest of the team and I were standing in circa 2022. We really like the spirit of this model. When I look at this, I'm like, wow, if these models can do what transformers can do, that's amazing. So I love linear systems, and I love simple compositions of linear systems. But this is a lot to digest. So can we simplify it in some way? And that's what led to our work on what we call S5. So the idea is to go back to the time domain and to just zoom in on this linear dynamical system and really to just look at a pair of time and ask, can we parallelize the computation of this feed-forward linear recursion? And to note that since it's linear, we can take a little graph segment that looks like this, the mapping from xt minus 1 to xt to xt plus 1, and we can just reduce it because the composition of linear updates is still a linear update. And so here, the mapping from xt minus 1 to xt plus 1, bypassing or collapsing or marginalizing xt, whatever you want to call it, is still a linear update, and the effective transition is a squared. The effective input is this combination of inputs from time t and t plus 1. Still linear. One thing to note, a squared, this is really a matrix-matrix multiply, generally cubic in the state size. Unlike the neural data examples where we want states to be low dimensional, here we really want states to be high dimensional so they can contain a lot of information about the past. We don't want to be doing matrix-matrix multiplies in really high dimensional matrices. What we do instead is we diagonalize the system and assume that these dynamics are diagonal and complex values. So that's for a single update. But now you can start to see how you might be able to come back to this picture and apply that same procedure, that same binary associative operator to all pairs of inputs in parallel if you have enough processors. Every one of those operations is going to eliminate one node in this graph and give you a length t over 2 sequence that's still a linear recursion. And so now once you've got it from t down to t over 2, go t over 2 to t over 4, the whole process just takes a logarithmic number of iterations in the length of the sequence. So if you have parallel hardware, you can do this in sublinear time. And in a schematic, what that looks like is something like this. You take all pairs of nodes, you collapse them, you take the results, you collapse them, and then this pass at the bottom is just going back and filling in the gaps, making sure that you get all the states, not just the final state. So we trained this model up, compared it to the other state-of-the-art models at the time, found that this model S5 was doing as well as the other simple state space layers, as well as some of the ones that came out of Meta at the same time. Transformers were doing remarkably bad on some of these tasks. In particular, this PathX task, which involves sequentially going through every pixel in an image and trying to tell at the end whether 2 points in the image are connected by a path. At the scale of roughly 16,000 pixels, this was just completely failing. Since then, people have gone back and figured out how to pre-train transformers and get them to solve this task as well. But at the time, this is what drove a lot of the excitement in this. We had the architecture that could capture these long-range dependencies very efficiently, and a real example of where, at least out of the box, transformer architectures were just not successful at all. We care about applications in neuroscience, so we looked at a neural latence benchmark task and found that this method was doing much better than the other state-of-the-art methods on this leaderboard, including the poor SLDS down here at the bottom. So, we've made improvements, I'm glad to say. I'll just pause also to say that we've since applied this to things like the speech decoding benchmarks from the NPTL, Jamie Henderson and Krishna Shenoy's group on trying to decode speech from brain recordings. And we haven't yet found these methods to compete with best recurrent neural networks from that lab, but that's something that we're actively working on. One cool thing that you can do when you have this S5 architecture that's not obvious in the S4 setting is that you can have different dynamics matrices A for different time steps. And so with that, you can do things like handle irregularly sampled observations. So this is a synthetic pendulum task. And we found that compared to the methods that were previously best on this, we were like 130 times faster and also lower error. So this was a big win in that domain. And if you're familiar with Mamba, the selective scan algorithm, aka S6 in Mamba, is using essentially the same trick. It's saying once you've cast it as a parallel scan, you can have different dynamics at each point in time, and those dynamics can depend on your inputs. And this is, I think, a big advance in terms of the capacity of these models. And of course, the other advance in this was a super fast implementation of parallel scan that's hardware optimized for GPUs that harkens back to some of Tree Dow's work from when he was a grad student. And I think Tree's going to be on the speaker list for later this quarter. So I think you have a lot to look forward to. Really cool stuff. All right, last but not least, let's go back to RNN. So, I said nonlinear RNNs, we have a general F, look like they're inherently sequential. If I compose two nonlinear functions, I get a nonlinear function out, but it doesn't necessarily have a compact representation in the same way that composition of linear functions do. So here is a cool idea, and this is one that I think I first saw in this paper by Lim et al. Earlier this year, but probably has other precedent elsewhere as well. The idea is, what if we take this dynamics function and we approximate it with a linear approximation? So we Taylor expand f of x around some initial guess, f of x at iteration I. Its first order Taylor approximation is a linear function of x. And so we'll call that f hat. Once we've got a linear approximation of f, we can apply all of our parallel scan tricks again. We're back into the regime where we can use all of our tricks for linear system. And this output of this linear recursion gives us new states. We can iteratively linearize around the new states. And this procedure, we can just run it until convergence.
Sorry, maybe I'm not understanding this clearly. Because you're linearizing at each time point, so you no longer have a time invariant linear system, right? Isn't that important for the parallelization?
That's the whole point of S5 is that we go back here. This update didn't have to be time invariant for S5. It does have to be for the convolution implementation, but for parallel scan, this just becomes AT times AT minus 1 instead of squared. So we can handle different dynamics, and indeed that's what we do for this time varying system because of the irregularly sampled observations. It's what this Mamba architecture does, where it makes A a function of the input. Also not all that different from the RSLDS, by the way. Like dynamics changing as a function of where you are in state space or where you are in input space. I think, at least I like to see things through the lens of RSLDS. So in a way, there's a connection. But you're right. Here, it's also time variant because f hat evaluated at the guess from time t is going to be different from f hat evaluated, or rather the Jacobian of f is going to be different at each point in time. Now, what is this algorithm doing? Well, there's a lot of ways to look at it. One way to look at it is that it's using Newton's method for finding the roots of a residual function, which is the difference between xt plus 1 and f of xt. You're trying to zero out that residual, and Newton's method is a way of finding roots of functions like that. Another way to think about it is that it's Gauss-Newton for minimizing the sum of squared residuals over time. So, depending on your preferred lens, there's many ways to see that this is a reasonable thing to do. And moreover, Newton's method, in some cases, in certain regimes, has very favorable convergence properties, like quadratic convergence rates. So we would expect this to converge really quickly for certain systems if we start close enough to a solution. Limit all, again, the folks who presented this method in the machine learning context call it DEAR, because they're using the parallel scan. I don't remember what DEAR stands for, but we like it. But what's better than DEAR? ELK. So sticking with the ungulate family, what is ELK? Well, the idea is Newton's method has many advantageous properties, but it does have some shortcomings. So one is that if you come back here, the Jacobians of F are generally going to be dense matrices. And this is going to be the same as that matrix multiply from S5 that I was talking about. That's going to be costly. So we'd like to be able to do something with diagonal matrices instead. That's going to eventually boil down to a quasi-Newton method, an approximate Jacobian. We call that quasi-DEAR. The other problem with Newton's method is that it can be unstable. And a simple way to see this is that if you linearize your RNN and your linearizations, your Jacobians have eigenvalues greater than 1, that system's going to diverge. It's going to blow up off to infinity. And so you're going to need some way to stabilize this. And one way to do so is using a trust region. It's sometimes called the Levenberg-Marquardt algorithm. And in this particular case, we show in this paper that it boils down to essentially running a Kalman filter on your data. So we call it ELK because that stands for evaluating Levenberg-Marquardt with Kalman. It's actually, backronym, as you can tell. And you can have quasi-ELK too, just like you can have quasi-DEAR. So is it better? Well, quasi-DEAR is much more efficient in terms of time and memory. These plots are showing relative to sequential evaluation and DEAR. It's both faster, and the points where DEAR is missing is because we ran out of memory on this GPU. Likewise, in terms of memory, sequential is about the best you can do. However, compared to the full-on DEAR, quasi-DEAR is much more memory efficient because it's storing diagonals instead of full Jacobian. And then for stability, here's an example where DEAR and quasi-DEAR both become numerically unstable. This is the true rollout of a nonlinear dynamical system. The red is the initial guess for this, and then we're going to use DEAR. And across iterations, what you see is when these lines go off to infinity, it's because things are diverging. And so it essentially gets linear, or not even, it's just, it takes t iterations to eventually evaluate the whole sequence of t steps. It gets there, but you have to keep resetting your state in order to get that convergence. If you damp it using ELK or quasi-ELK, here the frame rate's going to be much slower. You'll see that within a handful of iterations, this thing fills in the entire sequence to basically numerical precision. So this was a length 15,000 or something sequence. It converged in about 30 iterations. In terms of wall clock time, that's going to be way faster than sequential. And what is this system doing? Well, it's doing something that I think is kind of mind-blowing. What it's doing is it's evaluating an MCMC algorithm using this parallel evaluation scheme. So this is Metropolis. This is just Langevin dynamics. So we have some noise epsilon that's getting fed in, and then it's updating our state to follow the gradient of this log joint probability, which is here basically a mixture of two Gaussians. And over 15,000 steps, that Langevin algorithm traces out these two modes of this Gaussian distribution. But when we evaluate this thing in parallel, within a handful of iterations, it's generated 15,000 steps. And it's, I think, just a really cool and kind of, as I said, kind of a mind-blowing idea. Like MCMC is one of these canonical sequential algorithms. you iteratively update your state in order to generate a sequence of samples. Here, what we're saying is that you didn't have to run 15,000 steps of MCMC. You could have run 30 steps of Newton and gotten the same output. And just as a thought, we haven't followed up on this. This is literally fresh off the press. What if you truncate it, right? There's a lot of work in approximate variational inference. What if I just stop after 6 iterations? That's an approximate posterior distribution. And we can ask, how good of an approximation is this to the true posterior that MCMC would eventually give you? So anyway, just food for thought. I think once you start thinking in terms of, parallelizing sequential computations, you start to find a lot of sequential computations in your everyday life. And, not all of them can be parallelized. I think there's interesting theory work to do to say when things will converge in quadratic time versus effectively take linear time. But this is one example which I was very surprised actually worked, and I'm really excited to follow up on it.
Sorry, does this mean that you could take any Langeron sampler applied to an arbitrary probability density and get this to work?
Well, I don't know all the regimes in which it'll work or not. I think, in theory, it will work, but the question is in the rates of convergence. So this is an example where it converges in about 30 iterations. I think I'm really going off on a limb because we're talking about this now. We don't have the theory worked out. But I think one of the things that makes this particular example friendly to parallel evaluation is that within each mode of computation, things are pretty nice and stable. But there are these nonlinearities at the boundary. And indeed, that's where Deer and quasi-Deer blow up, is that you start to get states that are right at the boundary between these two Gaussian modes, and eventually your system becomes unstable and it diverges. But at least in this example, and I don't know, again, I think there's a lot of good work to be done now to figure out what densities and what Langevin dynamics with what step size lend themselves to parallel evaluation. And we're probably doing a lot of extra compute on running MCMC chains off to infinity when they could be done in more parallel fashion.
It would be a total game changer if you could do this for a general probabilistic program with differentiable and 30 iterations.
Well, putting on my, I'm being a little bit cautious about this. I think there's a lot of reason to be excited, but MCMC is also a canonical example of like a sharp P complete problem. In like the worst cases, there are ones where you do not expect it to mix quickly. And if we're saying like with a parallel machine, we can already do that, well, fine, let's talk about that, I think. But I think there are going to be cases where it won't work provably, but probably many cases where it can be done much better. Caleb?
Could you play this hierarchical parallelization trick on any kind of graph? And if you did it on a lattice, how would the result be like similar or different to a diffusion model?
Yeah. So by diffusion model, I assume you mean like the diffusion probabilistic model, right? Yeah. So there's actually some work from Stefano Erman's group using the same types of ideas to try to parallelize the diffusion evaluations, that you don't run key steps of your denoising process. They studied it under the name of Picard iterations, which I think are, don't quote me on this, I think they're very similar, but not exactly the same as what we're doing with Gauss-Newton and ELK. But it's the same, morally the same type of approach. Like linearize the diffusion around some current guess of the whole diffusion state, update your process linearly, relinearize, etc. So yeah, I think that's another good example of a currently very sequential and costly computation. All right, let me just conclude, and I'll take a couple more questions here. So, takeaways. One, if you like natural intelligence or you like artificial intelligence, I think state space models are for you, regardless. I think in the context of neuroscience, the technologies we have for measuring and perturbing neural systems make it a really exciting time for using these tools to, on the fly, generate bits of data, make testable predictions, do this closed loop neuroscience thing that we've been talking about for so long. I think we can finally start to see the payoff of that. Surprisingly, these humble linear dynamical systems are quite powerful even in machine learning contexts where transformers are still reigning. My hunch is that the ultimate solution here is going to be some combination of these two. There's a lot of great work trying to combine attention with deep state space models. So I think we're going to continue to see work of that kind. And really one of the other takeaways from I think this talk is that this type of work requires a lot of different types of expertise. So we need everybody in this room here, whether you're a neuroscientist or a computer scientist or a statistician or an engineer, there are lots of problems that you will have skill sets to contribute to, and so please do join us in this. Thanks to my lab, I've highlighted some of the people who came up earlier in the talk. Collaborators at Caltech were featured prominently in the beginning. Also very fortunate to work with many of the people in this room here for many years. So it's really great to be back and to share all this work with you. Thank you.
So, great talk. On the one hand, you have sequential MCMC. On the other hand, you have a parallel one you talked about. Do you think it's possible to smoothly interpolate between these two, and smoothly trade off space for time?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things you're getting at in the last part of that question, can you trade space for time in the same way as sequential for parallel? If you go back to some of the slides on memory, right? Yeah, sequential is the most memory efficient here. The reason it's growing with time is that we're not just constructing the states and discarding them, we're filling out the whole sequence of outputs, so that has to grow linearly with the length of the sequence, but it's, I think, a lower bound on what you can do with these systems. So yeah, if you're, I think one thing you could do is essentially like if you're memory bound on your GPU, grab a chunk of the sequence, evaluate it in parallel, flush it, keep just the last state and evaluate the next one. So, there is a simple solution there, and it's not that different from like checkpointing, backprop, for example. So yeah, that's like just off the cuff, a very first simple thing. I don't have to think more about it, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Number of iterations or any sort of analysis segmentation is when the very first one or second neuron is like going through like certain I think that's the spectrum is like worst case scenario can be like the mental
Yeah, I think my intuition is similar to yours, that in the worst case, there exist systems where the dependencies are sort of infinitely long. And in those cases, empirically, we have observed what looks like convergence rates that are growing linearly with the length of the sequence. A very simple example of that is a vanilla RNN. So F is tan H of WX, and W is a rotation matrix with an eigenvalue just greater than 1, so that when you linearize the system, the linearized dynamics blow up. But when you try to solve this with any damping, we tried many damping schemes, the convergence rates still look like they're roughly growing linearly with the length of the sequence. It's still like a constant factor less than that, but it's not like quadratic convergence rates that you would hope for. So honestly, I'm still developing my intuition as well. Like I think that regimes in which you might expect faster convergence are ones where the system is maybe more input driven, and less dependent on these really slow modes of the dynamical system. But we're at the early stages. We don't have any formal. Yeah, so I mean, there's a few ways you could do it. You could write a little while loop, so track convergence, and then when you get to machine tolerance or whatever, call it good. That's how the deer paper implements it. Here for these experiments, we just ran it out to far more iterations. We can prove that it will always converge in t time steps at most. We just run it and then see what the curves look like. But of course, if you were doing this inside of a training loop like we do in the paper, you want some sort of a stopping criterion. Another idea that is kind of interesting here is to think about this in the case of a deep generative model. So, S5 are stacks of linear dynamical systems. What if we literally go back to recurrent neural network, stacks of nonlinear RNNs, and on the forward pass, we evaluate them using this Newton trick. We just truncate it. We say our forward pass is always run 7 steps of Newton. And whatever comes out, that's what this dynamical system is. So, morally, it's a recurrent neural network, but practically, it's 7 steps of Newton applied to a recurrent. So that's your transformation. That's what your layer is. So if you stack those, I mean, that's going to be the model that we're training. So the model is 7 steps of Newton applied to a parameterized RNA. Learn me the best version of that model to do some input-output test. That encode that S5 is a special case where your dynamics function is linear and Newton converges in 1 step. This strictly generalizes it to nonlinear things, some number. So we're working on that too. If you stay tuned, in a couple months, we'll probably have some on what happens there.
Can I ask a question going back to the first part of our answer? Conceptually, so I guess I'm a little bit fuzzy about when do you imagine the transition from something like a transient regime to an attractor regime? Because when you look at your trajectories in the real data in the hypothalamus, there is sort of a trajectory going down, and flow fields around that still look like. So if you do a perturbation, let's say early on, before it gets to what you want to define, you just expect flow to follow some. Why don't you call that attractor?
So maybe let me try to make sure I understand the question. So in those flow fields, I could find them, but I have to click back a lot. One of the things you see is like a big starting point, like way off the manifold, and then it comes back down. So I'm not showing you the resting state before the intruder comes in. I'm just showing you where is the state when the mouse is dropped in, the intruder mouse is dropped into the cage. And that introduction of the intruder causes a big transient. It's like an input that couldn't have been predicted from the previous neural state. But once the intruder mouse is in there, then you see the decay.
I didn't realize.
Yeah, I also didn't show you what happens after the intruder mouse is taken out, in which case it does slowly ramp back down. You can see it in the paper a bit, but you can see eventually the internal state decays back down to sort of the resting point of that, where it's not very bad. All right, thank you all.